The first thing you remember is the smell, not the sweet scent of flowers in the fields, nor the smoke from your mother's clay oven, but the sharp, leathery tang that clung to your father's hands. Even when he came in from the cold evenings, his coat heavy with dust and rain, that smell of tanned hide never left him. It was the scent of work, of survival, of a craft handed down from one set of calloused hands to the next. You were born in a small village where lives were measured in seasons: planting, harvest, the cruel winter, and the brief but golden days of summer. Children ran barefoot in the mud, and women carried water from the well with ropes biting into their palms. Men bent their backs to the fields, chasing the stubborn promise of crops. But your family's trade was different. You were not tied to the fields or the plow. You were tied to shoes. Your father's workshop stood at the edge of the village square, a crooked little hut of timber and clay with a roof that sagged like an old horse-ass back. The windows were streaked with soot, and in winter the frost would lace them with silver threads. Inside, however, it was alive. Tools hung on pegs hammered straight into the beams. Awls, hammers, knives, and stretching frames lined the walls. The workbench was scarred and stained, bearing the marks of 100 repairs. Rolls of leather leaned against the walls, their surfaces gleaming like dark rivers in the dim light. And there, in the center, sat your father, shaping lives with his hands. As a boy, you would sit quietly, watching. At first, you only noticed the rhythm, the slow, steady tap of hammer against nail, the rasp of a knife slicing through hide, the creak of leather being stretched across a wooden last. It was almost like music, the kind that lulled you to sleep on the straw mat in the corner. But as you grew older, you began to see the meaning in the work. Every villager passed through that door eventually. Farmers who split their solace in the mud, women who needed new sandals for festivals, children who had outgrown their shoes too soon all came carrying hope that your father's hands could keep them walking. Shoes were not just protection from the earth's cruelty, they were dignity. A pair of boots could mean the difference between toiling in frostbitten fields and surviving another winter. A set of sturdy sandals could carry a pilgrim to the holy shrine 2 towns over. Your father often said, "Every step a man takes carries the shoemaker's mark." You did not fully understand it then, but his words settled deep in your bones. By the time you were 10, you were allowed to hold the smaller tools. At first, you ruined more scraps of leather than you saved. Your cuts were jagged, your stitches uneven. You pricked your fingers so often that they grew dotted with tiny scars. But your father never scolded you harshly. He only made you start again, repeating the work until the rhythm seeped into your body. He believed that shoemaking was not taught with words but absorbed, like water soaking into dry soil. The village itself became your classroom. You noticed the difference between the farmer's boots, heavy and patched, and the priest's shoes, polished and neat. You studied how the traveling merchants' pointed slippers curled at the ends, and how soldiers wore thick solace to endure the long march. Each pair told a story. Each soul bore witness to a life lived on the move. And you, though still a boy, longed to be the one who stitched those stories together. There was pride in being a shoemaker, but there was also a quiet humility. No one truly looked at the shoes when they were new. They looked at the man wearing them, or the path beneath his feet. The shoemaker's work was invisible, swallowed by daily use. And yet, when the leather split, when nails gave way, when feet bled from walking too far, then they remembered you. Then they came running. It was a strange kind of fame, one born not from glory but from necessity. You learned quickly that the shoemaker's life was bound to the village heartbeat. When harvest was good, people brought coins and asked for new shoes. When famine struck, they brought old ones, begging for repairs, paying in barley or eggs if not with money. In those years, your father accepted whatever he was given. A man must walk whether or not he can pay, he would say. And you understood that shoes were never truly luxury. They were survival. The winters of your youth were the hardest. Snow piled against the doors, and smoke from chimneys hung low in the air. Children ran barefoot until their feet were purple, and mothers wrapped them in rags. Your father worked late into the night, candlelight flickering over his bent shoulders as he stitched patches on old boots. You would lie on the mat, half asleep, listening to that same steady hammer tap. It was the sound of endurance, of a man refusing to let cold defeat him. When you were 13, your father placed a last in your hands. "This is yours now," he said, his voice gruff but proud. It was a wooden foot form, worn smooth from years of use. You cradled it like a treasure. That day you made your first shoe, not perfect, not beautiful, but yours. The seams were crooked, the leather stiff, but when you slipped it onto your own foot, it held. You had created something that carried you forward. That night you dreamed not of playing in the fields, but of rows of shoes lined neatly in your own workshop, each one whispering stories of the lives they would walk. By 15, you were no longer an apprentice, but a partner. Villagers began to call you the shoemaker's boy, and they came to you with their needs. Your hands grew rougher, your cuts surer, your stitches straighter. You could judge a man's weight and work by looking at his footprints. You could tell if a woman was expecting by the swelling of her feet. Slowly you were becoming what your father was, a guardian of steps, a silent companion to every journey. But even as you honed your craft, you began to feel the world beyond the village stirring. Traveling merchants brought news of wars, of kings raising taxes, of distant cities where shoemakers no longer worked alone but in crowded workshops. They spoke of machines that could stitch faster than any man's hand. To you, it sounded like a distant storm, rumbling at the horizon. Your father only shook his head. Here, people will always need a shoemaker, yet you wondered, late at night, if the world would leave your village untouched. Still, for now, life remained steady. You woke each morning to the crow of roosters, swept the shavings from the workshop floor, and set to work. You mended sandals worn thin from the summer roads, hammered nails into boots cracked by winter frost, and crafted new pairs for children whose feet grew too fast. And every evening, as the village settled into quiet, you smelled the leather on your hands and thought of the generations before you. You were the shoemaker's son. And soon you would simply be the shoemaker. The workshop was the heart of your world. Not the fields, not the church, not even the market square where villagers gathered on feast days, but the cramped, dimly lit space where leather and wood and iron came together to serve the simple purpose of keeping people walking. Morning always began the same. The rooster crowed, dogs barked, and the smell of smoke from hearths drifted in through the cracked shutters. Before you even broke bread, you swept the floor. Strips of leather, curls of wood, stray nails, and the thin dust of yesterday's work lay scattered. You learned long ago that a shoemaker's shop was as much a reflection of his pride as the shoes he made. A tidy floor, tools hung in their places, and scraps sorted into piles. This was discipline, and discipline was the soul of craft. Your tools were your companions. You knew their weight better than you knew the weight of your own body. The awl, with its sharp point, pierced holes with a precision no clumsy nail could match. The hammer, not too heavy and not too light, tapped nails into solace with a rhythm that became part of your breath. The knife, your favorite tool, cut through hide with a satisfying scrape, its edge honed so keen that it seemed to whisper across the surface. Then there were the wooden lasts, smooth from years of handling. Each one carved to resemble a foot, each one a silent partner in the birth of a shoe. You never worked quickly. Speed was for the careless. Instead, you moved with patience, with the certainty that every stitch, every cut, every nail mattered. First came the measuring. You would take a strip of twine, loop it around the customer's foot, and mark the length with chalk. You studied the curve of the arch, the thickness of the heel, the way the toes spread when weight was applied. To the untrained eye, a foot was a foot. To you, each one was as distinct as a face. A careless shoemaker could wound a man worse than a sword if the fit was wrong. Once measured, you chose the leather. Thick cowhide for boots that must endure the mud of the fields. Softer goat leather for sandals meant for festivals and Sundays. Occasionally, if a wealthy merchant passed through, you might use imported leather, fine, supple, and almost too smooth to touch. The choice of material was not merely about comfort. It was about destiny. A farmer's boots must withstand years of toil. A priest's shoes must carry dignity as much as flesh. A child's pair must be made with allowance for growth, for children's feet were restless things. Cutting leather was an art of silence. You laid the hide flat across the bench, pressed your chalk lines with steady hands, and sliced carefully along the grain. The sound of the knife cutting through was soft, almost like tearing cloth, but heavier, richer. Pieces emerged slowly, the vamp, the quarters, the sole. Each was laid aside, ready to be joined, much like puzzle pieces awaiting their form. Then came stitching. Thread soaked in wax slid through the holes you pierced with the awl. You pulled the thread tight, feeling it bite into the leather. Stitch after stitch, row after row, until the shape of a shoe began to take form. There was something almost holy in this part, the transformation of lifeless pieces into a single, breathing whole. You often thought of it as mending not just shoes, but the very path people would walk. Nailing the sole was the most satisfying. The leather upper stretched across the last, the sole pressed beneath it, nails driven in with steady taps. Tap, 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 a rhythm as old as the craft itself. Some evenings, villagers said they could hear that sound echoing through the square long after the sun went down. It was the heartbeat of your life, steady, unwavering, and eternal. Your customers came and went throughout the day. The farmer arrived with boots so battered they seemed more whole than shoe. His feet were swollen, his toes calloused, yet he smiled with hope. You promised him another year of wear, patching the solace and stitching the tears. The priest came, fussing about scuffs on his polished shoes, reminding you that appearances mattered more than comfort. You nodded, repaired them carefully, though you silently thought of the farmer's needs as the truer work. Children darted in, shy but curious, holding their mother's hands. You always knelt to meet them at eye level, measuring their tiny feet, imagining how quickly they would outgrow your handiwork. The shoemaker's shop was never only about shoes. It was the gossip house, the storyteller's corner, the place where news passed hands as often as coins. Villagers would linger while you worked, talking about harvests, weddings, illnesses, or the ever-present rumor of taxes. You listened, stitching quietly, learning more about people from their words than they realized. To many, you became not just the shoemaker, but the silent confidant. Their lives were sewn into your memory as tightly as your threads were sewn into leather. Meals were quick and plain. A chunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, sometimes an onion or a bowl of broth if luck allowed. You ate with your hands still smelling of leather and wax. Rest was rare, work stretched into dusk and often beyond. Candles sputtered, shadows grew long, yet the hammer never ceased. The village depended on you, and dependence was a chain as heavy as iron. Not every day was equal. Some were quiet, with little more than a few repairs. Others were relentless. Before feast days or market fairs, people flooded in, demanding new shoes or polished ones to show their best face to the world. Those nights, your hands cramped, your eyes blurred, and yet you pressed on. A shoemaker could not say no. A bare foot on a festival day was a shame too cruel to allow. You grew older, and so did your hands. Calluses thickened, scars multiplied. A needle slipped once, piercing deep into your thumb. A knife cut across your palm another time, yet you barely noticed. Pain became as familiar as breath, and you carried on because the work did not forgive weakness. There were small joys. The satisfaction of watching a child walk out proudly in a new pair of sandals. The nod of gratitude from a farmer when his boots were returned stronger than before. The sound of coins clinking into your wooden box, modest but steady. These moments stitched meaning into the endless repetition of labor. Evenings came slowly, the air heavy with the smell of leather, the floor littered with scraps. You cleaned your tools, banked the fire, and stepped outside. The square was quiet by then, lanterns glowing in windows, smoke curling into the darkening sky. You looked at your hand-stained, rough, tired, and knew tomorrow would be the same. And yet, in that sameness lay something eternal. While crops failed and kings rose and fell, the need for shoes remained unchanged. Feet wore down, paths stretched endlessly, and you, the shoemaker, stood as the quiet guardian of every journey. The village was small, no more than a scatter of cottages around a dusty square, yet to you it was the entire world. You knew every stone in the paths, every bend in the stream, every tree that shaded the fields. Life here moved slowly, shaped by seasons and rituals, but within that rhythm there was a depth that only those who lived it could understand. And at the center of it all, in ways subtle and unseen, stood the shoemaker's craft. From the moment you stepped out of your workshop each morning, you were reminded of your place. The children who ran barefoot past your door waved shyly, knowing their mothers would bring them to you when their solace could no longer bear the gravel roads. The old men nodded, their boots patched and repatched by your hands, each step a quiet testimony to your work. Women carrying baskets to the well would sometimes pause, asking whether their husbands' shoes were ready, or if you could make slippers to keep their children's feet warm for the coming winter. The village itself was like a living shoemaker's book. The farmers' heavy boots dragged through the mud and left deep prints in the soil. The priests' polished shoes clicked across the flagstones of the churchyard. The children's sandals scuffed the paths near the stream, worn thin from games and mischief. Everywhere you looked, you saw the trace of shoes, and by extension, the trace of your own hands. It was as if the ground itself whispered the story of your labor. Market days were the liveliest. Once every week, traders and villagers gathered in the square, spreading their wares on blankets or wooden stalls. The air filled with the cries of merchants, the smell of spices and roasted meats, the braying of livestock. You often set up a small bench outside your workshop on these days, displaying a few ready-made pairs, simple sandals, sturdy boots, children's shoes. Villagers and strangers alike paused to inspect them. Some bargained fiercely, offering grain or wool instead of coins. Others admired the craftsmanship, but sighed, admitting they could not afford a new pair just then. It was on market days that you learned most about the world beyond your village. Merchants brought not only goods, but news tales of distant wars, of kings raising armies, of taxes being collected harshly in nearby towns. They wore shoes unlike any you had seen, pointed slippers embroidered with gold, boots with heels high enough to make them tower above common folk. You studied them carefully, tracing their seams with your eyes, imagining how you might replicate such work with the tools and leather you had. Sometimes, if a merchant was generous, he let you touch them. Those moments filled you with both wonder and envy. Festivals, too, tied you deeply to village life. Before every celebration, harvest feasts, weddings, or holy days, your workshop became a hive of activity. Women came demanding new sandals for dancing, men requested polished boots for parades, and children begged for shoes that would make them look grown. You worked long into the nights, candlelight flickering against the leather, your fingers aching, your eyes stinging with fatigue, yet you never refused them. Festivals were moments of pride for the village, and you would not let anyone walk into them in shame. On the day of a festival, you stood in the square and watched as your work came to life. Feet moved in rhythm to the fiddler's tune, children skipped in circles, elders walked slowly with dignity. Everywhere you looked, shoes you had cut, stitched, and nailed danced across the earth. It was a strange joy to see your craft so invisible, so taken for granted, and yet so essential. Without you, the dancing would have been painful, the marching blistered, the walking hobbled. You were the hidden thread weaving the community together. But life in the village was not only about joy. There were hardships, and you bore them as much as anyone else. When famine struck, bellies shrank and coins disappeared. Few could afford new shoes. They came instead with broken ones, pleading for repairs. Some brought nothing at all, only promises of payment once the fields yielded again. You stitched and patched as best you could, often accepting eggs, milk, or firewood in exchange. Sometimes you accepted nothing at all, for how could you turn away a barefoot child when winter's frost was already biting? There were times of sickness, too, when fevers swept through the cottages and the village bells tolled too often. People walked less then, and shoes gathered dust by their beds. You found yourself idle, your hands restless, your heart heavy with worry. A shoemaker lived not by the wealth of the people, but by their health, and in those dark weeks, your work seemed to vanish into silence. Still, even in hardship, the village turned to you. A man whose wife was buried asked you to mend his old boots so he could walk to her grave each day. A soldier passing through requested repairs before marching to war, his eyes hollow with fear. A young bride begged for slippers on her wedding day, though she had no coin to offer. You gave them what they needed, for in each request there was something larger than shoes. There was dignity, memory, hope. In quieter moments, when the square was empty and the fields hummed with the low song of insects, you would sit outside your workshop and watch. Life unfolded around you like the slow turning of a wheel. Children grew, elders passed, seasons shifted, and always people walked. Always, feet pressed against the earth, carrying burdens, joys, sorrows. And always, they came back to you, the shoemaker, the one who made those journeys possible. You sometimes wondered if people truly saw you. Did they understand how much of their lives passed through your hands? Or were you merely another tradesman, useful but invisible? Perhaps it did not matter. For you, the meaning was not in recognition but in continuity. As long as there were paths to walk, there would be need for shoes. As long as there were shoes, there would be need for a shoemaker. And so your place in the village was secure, not loud or celebrated, but steady, enduring, eternal. At night, when the village settled into silence and only the crickets sang, you lay on your straw mat and thought of all the steps taken that day. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, echoing softly in the dark. And though you could not see them, you knew your work was there, carrying the weight of lives across the soil. Shoemaking, like life, was never only steady rhythm and quiet satisfaction. It was also hardship and welcome visitors, hungry winters, and the creeping awareness that the world beyond your village was changing faster than you could stitch leather together. The first hardship was always poverty. You lived in a village where coins were as scarce as gold, where most families measured wealth not in silver, but in sacks of barley, in healthy goats, in the survival of children through winter. Shoes were never the first priority. A family would buy seed, salt, oil, or cloth before they thought of new boots. And so most of your days were spent mending old shoes, patching solace that should have been replaced years before, sewing scraps onto scraps until the leather was more stitch than hide. You learned to accept payment in whatever form it came. Sometimes it was a jug of milk, sometimes a basket of onions, sometimes only a promise. Once, a farmer gave you a chicken for a pair of boots. Another time, a widow left a loaf of bread on your doorstep in return for the shoes you had made for her boy. There were lean months when your own table was bare, when you chewed on coarse bread and drank weak broth, while your hands ached from work that barely kept you fed. But you carried on because a shoemaker could not abandon the village any more than a field could abandon the crops it bore. Then there were the traveling merchants. They came into the square with bright wagons, hawking wares finer than anything your rough hands could make. Their shoes glittered with buckles of brass, their slippers embroidered with colored thread, their boots dyed in rich hues you could not afford to reproduce. Villagers, dazzled by the novelty, sometimes spent what little coin they had on these foreign luxuries. For a time, you would see them walking proudly, their new shoes catching every eye. But after weeks, the stitching frayed, the solace thinned, and the merchants were long gone. They always left behind disappointment, and you, the shoemaker, tasked with repairing what should never have failed so soon. And yet, the sting remained. You felt the weight of competition, the fear that one day your work might be cast aside for the lure of faster, cheaper, prettier shoes from distant places. Your father had warned you of this. A shoemaker's pride is not in beauty alone. It is in endurance. Make them strong, and they will always return to you. You clung to those words, though sometimes, in the quiet of night, you wondered whether strength was enough to keep the world from passing you by. War was another shadow. Soldiers marched through your village from time to time, their boots thick, caked with mud, worn from endless roads. They came hungry, demanding food and lodging, sometimes taking more than they were offered. Their boots fascinated you. Heavy leather reinforced with iron nails, designed to last across miles of unforgiving terrain. Yet even these wore down, and desperate soldiers came to your door, offering coins or trinkets in exchange for quick repairs. You patched their solace, hammered their nails, and wondered where those boots would march next into battle, into death, into history itself. But war brought fear to the village. Men were taken for conscription, leaving families behind. Taxes rose, levied by distant kings who never cared whether your people had enough to eat. With every passing year, you saw more hardship etched into the faces of your neighbors. Shoes became thinner, patched more times than you could count because new leather was too costly to waste. Sometimes you stitched pieces of old boots together to form new ones, a cobbler's trick born of necessity rather than craft. The seasons themselves turned against you. In summer, the heat cracked the leather, and dust wore solace thin. In winter, snow soaked into shoes, freezing the threads, splitting seams open. You worked hardest in those months, sewing late into the night as villagers begged for repairs before frostbitten mornings. Your fingers grew stiff in the cold, the awl biting deeper than it should, but you pressed on. A shoemaker could not let the village walk barefoot across snow. And then there were the quiet hardships, loneliness, invisibility, the slow wearing down of spirit. You were not a farmer who could measure success in golden fields, nor a merchant who returned from journeys with stories of distant lands. You were a shoemaker, always in the same corner of the square, your world limited to leather, tools, and the endless rhythm of hammer and thread. There were days when you longed for escape, for adventure beyond the village paths. Yet when merchants passed, when soldiers spoke of cities with crowded streets, you felt a strange pull backward, as though your heart were nailed to your bench like leather to a soul. Still, you endured. Hardship was not the end of the shoemaker, it was the shoemaker's proving. Each trial reminded you why the craft mattered. You learned to stretch every scrap of leather, to turn waste into worth. You discovered the art of patience, of stitching not only shoes, but trust. You became part of the fabric of resilience that held the village together. When famine came, when soldiers marched, when winters froze the streams solid, you remained, your workshop light flickering late into the night, a small beacon of persistence. But the greatest hardship was time itself. As you grew older, you noticed your hands trembling after long hours. Your eyesight dimmed, the stitches blurring beneath the candlelight. Younger men began to mutter about newer ways, about machines in the cities that could do the work of 10 shoemakers in half the time. You had never seen such machines, but the rumors alone carried weight. The world beyond the village was changing. How long before even your steady craft became a relic? And yet, as you sat by your bench, surrounded by scraps and tools worn smooth by decades of use, you realized that your life was not defined by hardship alone. Hardship was the shape of the road, but your shoes, the shoes you made, were what carried people across it. Every patched boot, every stitched sole, every nail hammered into leather was an act of defiance against the weight of poverty, war, and time. The world might shift, but as long as feet touched earth, they would need you. So you carried on, day after day, year after year, enduring the hardships that pressed upon you like ill-fitting shoes. And through it all, you found a strange kind of peace, for even in struggle there was rhythm. Even in hardship there was meaning. And even in the shadow of change there was the eternal truth. No journey began without a shoemaker's hands. The years folded over themselves the way leather folds into shape beneath the press of a practiced palm. You had grown old in the village, your hair whitening like the chalk dust that clung to the edges of your workbench. Your hands cracked with time, yet still capable of the measured grace that shoemaking demanded. By now, every family in the village had owned, at one time or another, a pair of shoes born beneath your roof. Some were carried proudly to weddings, polished to a shine with oil and care. Others were battered by years of toil in the fields until the solace thinned and the stitching frayed. Yet all of them bore the quiet imprint of your hands. Apprentices had come and gone. Some were restless boys, eager at first but quickly bored by the slow rhythm of craft. They dreamed of city life, of markets far larger than the village, where shoes were no longer made by hand but stamped out by iron machines. They drifted away, their memories of your workshop fading like smoke. But a few stayed quiet ones who found comfort in the sound of your all-piercing leather, who found meaning in the way you muttered measurements or tapped nails into solace with patient certainty. Those who stayed learned not just how to craft a shoe, but how to see the work as a binding thread between people, earth, and time. Your bench was no longer just your own. 2 apprentices had set their tools beside yours, their hands younger, their eyes sharp with learning. The hammer passed between palms that bore fewer lines than yours, yet each swing echoed yours faithfully. When you sat back, your body aching, you saw them continue without hesitation. The rhythm lived on. But as the years gathered, the village itself changed. Roads once trodden by barefoot farmers or wrapped in your sturdy leather shoes were being smoothed by carts from the city. Merchants arrived more often now, bringing machine-made goods cheaper, brighter, perfect in symmetry, yet lacking the spirit of touch. Your neighbors admired the glitter of those things. Yet, when the first rains fell and their stitched edges unraveled, they came back to you, humbler, holding shoes that had failed them. They always said the same, "It seems a machine cannot replace your hands." It was not pride you felt then, but a deep, steady quiet like the glow of embers long after the fire has burned. Pride flickers. This was something else. It was recognition that your life's labor had not been wasted. Every shoe that left your bench had been more than leather and thread. They were trust. They were dignity. They were the difference between a child arriving at the winter festival with bare, freezing feet or stepping proudly beside his family with boots that would endure the snow. The seasons kept their march, and each year added weight to your shoulders. Festivals that once saw you dancing in the square were now occasions where you sat by the fire, watching the younger villagers whirl with energy. Yet your work was never far from sight. When you looked at the circle of dancers, you noticed shoes you had crafted years ago, still strong, carrying their wearers through laughter and music. It was as though your hands reached into every movement, every step. You realized that you had been part of lives in ways invisible yet constant. There were stories whispered by the old ones, stories that linked your name with moments of survival. The farmer who trekked miles through storm and flood, his shoes holding against the mud, saving him from losing a season's worth of harvest. The young bride whose wedding slippers you had stitched with quiet devotion, ensuring her first steps into her new home would be steady and graceful. The soldier who left for distant battles, carrying boots you had built strong enough to face roads his family would never see. Some never returned, but the shoes did, weathered and torn, handed back to you as relics of a life once lived. You never charged for mending those. You mended them in silence, as if stitching together the memory of the man himself. On certain nights when the air grew cold and the village fell quiet, you sat by the dim light of your oil lamp and wondered about the meaning of it all. You had never traveled far. Your world had been measured in cobbler's tape, divided into lasts, shaped by awls and hammers. Yet within that narrow circle you had lived fully. To be a shoemaker was to be part of every journey, to mark every road, even when you yourself never set foot on it. You thought of the young faces that had once crowded your bench. Children who pressed their noses against the workshop window to watch you cut leather, eyes wide with curiosity. Many of those children were grown now. Their lives stretched into trades of their own, farmers, bakers, even merchants who carried goods beyond the village. But all of them at some point had stood tall in shoes you had made. Even when they forgot, even when your name was not spoken, your work had carried them forward. That, you realized, was legacy, not a monument, not wealth, not stories carved in stone, but the quiet, enduring service woven into everyday life. The final years came as gently as falling snow. Your hands slowed, your apprentices took on more of the work, and you spent more time speaking than stitching, telling them of small tricks you had learned. How to soften leather with oil rubbed in circles. How to choose thread that would not rot in damp weather. How to measure not just the foot, but the gait of the person. Because shoes are not for standing still, but for living. They listened, sometimes smiling at the old wisdom, sometimes writing it down, as if each word carried more weight than the tools themselves. And when at last you could no longer work, your bench remained, not as an empty relic, but as a living heart of the workshop. Your apprentices, now masters in their own right, kept it exactly as you had left it. The gouged surface, the tiny knife marks, the smooth edge where your arm had rested for decades, all remained untouched. Customers still came, some asking for new shoes, others simply pausing to glance at your bench as if expecting you to rise from it again. You passed from the world as quietly as you had lived in your small house, beneath a roof patched with your own careful hands. On the day of your burial, the village gathered in solemn silence. There were no grand speeches, no monuments, But as the villagers walked behind your bier, one could see it plainly. The shoes they wore, sturdy, well-kept, crafted with patience, were your eulogy. With every step they took on that day, your memory was carried, not in words, but in the sound of solace meeting earth. Generations would come and go. Roads would be paved, machines would replace hands, and the world beyond the village would spin faster with each passing year. Yet, in your village, in the quiet corners of memory, you remained. The shoemaker who had stitched not only leather, but the lives of his people together. The shoemaker whose hands shaped not just shoes, but the very rhythm of walking, dancing, laboring, and living. And so your life ended as it had begun, humbly, quietly, with leather and thread. But your story lived on in every journey begun, in every field crossed, in every child who ran laughing across the square. You were the village shoemaker. And though the world would forget, your village never would.